All right, so Ben is a member of, let me pull up, he's got a, here we go, I got some deets here we go. Common Ground USA, which is an advocacy organization. Also, as he stated before, used to be a member of, or was part of Sunrise Movement during his undergrad, and presently works for the U.S. Department of Commerce. However, I should say that none of the views that he is going to be sharing with us tonight are in any way representative of either the Department of Commerce or the other organization that I just named, Common Ground USA. So just that being said, Ben is an expert on land value tax. I've been reading the things that he has to say for like a few months now, and he's extremely knowledgeable on the subject. And if you've never heard of land value tax before, he will break it down for you in a way that will hopefully be digestible, understandable, and something that you feel motivated to act upon. All right, with that said, thanks for joining us, Ben. Take it away.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so like you mentioned earlier, I'm a member of Common Ground USA. The advocacy org, what it mostly pushes for is for the adoption of this land value tax policy in the United States. In fact, its California chapter actually I think is the biggest one in the U.S. I'm part of the Oregon-Washington chapter, right? So sorry, say that again. I thought somebody said something. So anyway, the big thing that really drives my passion for land value tax implementation is its ability to be used not only just to create better land use in our cities and communities, but also its implications as an eco-tax. So I have, if I can share screen, I have a presentation with some lovely visuals that will hopefully break down how these work. Let's see, I've got screen sharing still disabled. If somebody has that.
Yeah, sorry, one sec. Give me just a minute. All right, you should be good.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully we should all be able to see. Okay, so how does land value tax, first and foremost, how does it actually work, right? So where does land value even come from in the first place? Well, first we got to talk about what exactly even is land, right? So there's a layman understanding, layman definition of land as like the dirt, soil, the stuff that we all walk on every day, and then there's the economics definition of land, right? And the economics definition of land is basically any natural resource not created by anybody, right? It was just made by nature or God or whoever you believe or don't believe in. It's fixed in supply, and as a result of its fixed supply and created by nobody, it generates economic rents. And I'll talk about that in a bit as well. So now that we kind of understand land value tax more broadly refers to this economic definition of land. But for most intents and purposes, it really does have to do with this layman's definition of land as like the dirt, right? And the value of that land, of course, comes from the three rules of real estate that we're all very familiar with, right? Location, location, location. But what does that actually mean, right? So there's essentially three things that determine the value of land. There's the inherent natural resources that are present in certain parcels of land, right? So if a parcel of land has a river coming through it, or a lake, or maybe it's by a bay or a sea or ocean, right? It tends to be more valuable land because of the access to water, whether it's for agriculture, irrigation purposes, or because you want to be able to ship goods more efficiently or whatnot, connecting to other communities, that kind of thing. Land that has lots of good topsoil in it, of course, for similar reasons, right? So different natural characteristics of land can increase or decrease the value of that land. And then, of course, comes things like public infrastructure or just government activity around land. So public transportation, hospitals, schools, utilities, parks, all these wonderful things add value to land because they're on that land and they make that land essentially more productive. And then, of course, is the final component of what brings value to land, which is the community, right? So when you have a lot of people together in a shared space, or at least a higher density of people on land, that drives up the land value, because the more people you have together, and ideally the more diverse that community of people is, the more productive it is, right? When you have a lot of people concentrated in a city, you get these gains from economies of scale. People are able to do more efficient, they're able to do their things more efficiently. We're more productive when we're around each other. We get to organize and do things more efficiently than we otherwise would have. You get specialization in labor as a result of cities. And this has been the general rule of human civilization for as long as human civilization has existed, right? It's progress that is born out of these cities, right? So again, just to recap, right? Land as a resource is special. It's fixed in supply. Nobody created it. And also the last part, which is what particularly makes it special, is that it's immovable, right? You can't really move land into an offshore bank account like you can stocks or bonds or income, right? When land is in Long Beach, it's in Long Beach. It's not in the Bahamas like corporate income can be. So it makes it as an effective tool for taxation much easier, which I'll also touch on in a bit. But that immovableness is also very important for understanding how landlords and land productivity plays into all of this, right? So this is where we get into land rents. And land rents is kind of like a representation, a monetary representation of the productivity of land. So if we start off just kind of like, you know, in the state of nature, right? We've got all this land, nobody owns it yet. We've got these 3 plots of land, and then let's pretend I'm a landlord. I come along and I purchased lot A for whatever amount of money, doesn't matter. But I stick down to a sign after purchasing it, and I say, this is my private property now. And if you want to use my land, I'm going to charge you some rent to use it. I get to keep that rent that you pay me, and then whatever is left after using this land for its productivity, you know, you get that left over in wages. And we have these 3 plots of land, the first 2, of course, being essentially identical. They have 100 utility value of their productivity, right? And then, of course, this lot C, which is far less productive. Maybe it's just desert land. I don't know. It's not very productive, right? So you, as this humble farmer, are going to look at the situation. And of course, you're going to say, well, why would I go to lot A, who's charging me this rent, right? I'm going to go to lot B. Lot B is owned by nobody. I get to use it for its full production value, right, of 100 utils. I pay no rent. And I get to collect 100 wages as a result. And you're, of course, going to ignore lot C because lot C only has 10 utils. And we're under this assumption in economics that people are going to maximize utility, right? It's a good thing to be able to produce more bread for yourself, right? It's good for when maybe harvests down the road aren't great. And so it's nice to have a stockpile. Maybe you've got friends and family you want to provide some bread for, right? You're going to want to maximize bread, essentially. Well, I, as a landlord, am not a fan of this. I really don't like when you can just ignore my private property and my rent seeking, and you can just go to other land and be as productive as you would have on my land, but for free. So what is the natural solution to this for me as a landlord? Well, I buy lot B. And so by purchasing lot B, I now have both the 2 most productive lots of land, both at 100 utils. And as a result, what I'm going to do is I'm going to charge you 90 utils of rent for either lot A or B in order to work on this land. And so you are forced to choose between essentially working on either highly productive land, paying a really high rent to me, equivalent to 90 rent utils, or you'll be forced off to this less productive, this marginal land, and have that nobody is owning, right? Because it's low productivity, but as a result, right, you get really low wages. And at the end of the day, you as this humble farmer are making the same amount. Meanwhile, I, as a landlord, get to collect this rent that otherwise should have gone to you, right? I'm collecting rent by owning a resource that I did not create. And the only reason I've gotten to it is because of this first mover advantage, right? I happened to be there before you did, by no merit, just timing and luck, purchase this land, and I now get to capitalize and collect all this free rent and having put in no labor at all. And I stress this point because this is a problem that is incredibly pervasive in our cities and communities around the country, and is a very silent kind of problem that we've just all accepted, right, and not really questioned much, and what the effects of this rent-seeking activity have on broader society, right? So as a result of this, again, we get pushed into this marginal land, this less productive land. So to correct this, we introduce the land value tax. And what a land value tax does is essentially comes in and says, okay, well, the landlord is charging this 90 rent, right? This is the productive value, the rent value of this land. So if we were to charge a 100% land value tax, right, the government collects this 90 rent, these 90 utils from the landlord. The landlord no longer gets to collect this free rent that they get solely from just owning land, doing nothing else, but owning a scarce fixed resource, right? And it goes into the public treasury. And it goes into the public treasury to be used for public services, public infrastructure, and what many land value tax advocates also push for as well is citizens' dividend, which is like, universal basic income, but it comes out of this rent, which again is created from the community, right? So it is your labor being returned back to you. And how this actually functions, right? We have a lovely graph for any of you who have had to sit through a grueling macro or microeconomics class, you might recognize this. And what maybe should hopefully stands out is that the supply curve, right, rather than being a curve, it's a straight line, right? Because again, the supply of land in this case is fixed. It does not change, right? So what happens is first you've got this market price, right? This is what it is. This is what the price of the land is before the implementation of a land value tax. And that blue shaded area, that producer surplus, that represents the land rent, right, that they get to collect on. And then of course this consumer surplus is you, the user of that land. That's what you get out of it. So whenever we implement taxes on goods, generally speaking, what happens is the supply of that good goes down, the price goes up, and the amount that people are consuming of it also goes down as a result, right? So throw in a sales tax on food, for example, which is something that my home state has, which is very incredibly regressive, right? We are punishing the consumption of food, which is very silly, right? So what happens is there is a deadweight loss as a result of the sales tax. Because less is supplied, and less is supplied at a higher price. Consumers are able to consume less than they otherwise would have, so that eats into their consumer surplus. And the producers, the people who are actually supplying the food, receive less sales and less revenue as a result. So that less producer surplus comes from them, right? So they get less of that. That's their deadweight loss. But a land value tax doesn't have a deadweight loss, right? All that happens is it eats into the producer surplus, which you see on the right side, which is represented by that rectangle. That's the whole tax revenue that the government receives after a 100% land value tax, right? And what you'll notice too, and it's not very intuitive with the figure on the right, but what essentially happens is the market price for land approaches zero. And in some cases gets about exactly zero, right? As a function of taxing the entire value of that rent, which is incredibly important when it comes to government spending money or trying to do public infrastructure investments, especially in the case of public transit, for example, right? They're going to announce that they will be extending a line somewhere, right? And so what happens is land speculators, they buy up all that land along the line where the government announces they're going to build up this new subway line or light rail or whatever, right? And then this becomes incredibly costly for the local government to build out this land, or build out this transit expansion, because now they have to pay much higher costs for this land. I'm sure all of you are going to be are probably very well aware of this in the context of California high-speed rail, right? Land acquisitions have been an incredibly expensive part of that that whole process and having to deal with the local interests of that, right? And so a land value tax would help immensely with that problem of land speculation. So the obvious solution, right, should be to just tax the land. And as I've said many times, the land value tax, it captures, again, the publicly generated land value, right, the rents, which come from the community simply by being there, by being great and productive and working together and all that, and returns them to the public treasury. So how this would actually work out in real life, there's a great figure right here, which is under the current scheme, under the current property tax regime, we have, we treat land and buildings improvements as essentially the same thing, right? We tax them at an equal rate. We treat them equally, but they're not equal, right? Because buildings and housing, excuse me, the supply of those can go up and they can go down, but the supply of land, again, does not. It's fixed, right? So what happens is whenever, again, whenever you tax something, in most cases where the supply is elastic, when the supply can change, you, by taxing it, increase the price and increase the price of it, and you decrease the supply at the same time. So the current property tax scheme, what it does is it creates this perverse incentive for property owners to actually not build densely like we would want them to, because, you know, obviously dense development is energy efficient, it's more sustainable, it's more land efficient. So instead, we are encouraging this low density development in our cities, and more so than that in some cases as well, when the property tax is particularly high, we actually encourage the dilapidation of properties, because what that does is it lowers their tax base, the tax liability that they have to the local jurisdiction by letting the property fall into disrepair. And at the same time, because they're not paying an annual land value tax, they get to capitalize on the increase in land rents that come from all the hard work of the community in the area, right? So they pay less taxes over time, and then 10, 15 years after the community has done all the hard work, they get to sell the land for an incredibly high profit at the expense of everybody else, right? And under a land value tax, this is different. So under a land value tax, on the bottom, you see you have the exact same parcel of land. Of course, we're assuming that this land is in the exact same location, right? Same size and everything. The tax liability that is faced by the landowner is the same, regardless of how much they actually build on that. So what you see under a land value tax is an economic incentive to instead build dense and to maximize the productivity potential of your land, right? So that way you have a greater ratio of revenue to tax. Because if you just have an empty lot, let's say a parking lot that's downtown, right? Not really generating a lot of revenue, right? Under the current property tax scheme, they pay very little in property taxes compared to a building that's right next door, taking up the same amount of land, but it's 10 or 15 stories tall, right? Under a land value tax, they would essentially be paying the same amount of tax. And in fact, if anything, the owner of the parking lot or a vacant lot or whatever that's downtown, they would see their land tax, their general tax liability would significantly increase. So they would be encouraged and, quite frankly, forced into developing that land. And if they don't have the money to develop that land because they've just been holding on to this land and speculating it, right? Then they are forced into a situation where they have to sell off that land to somebody who will use it for its full productive value, somebody who will develop it into housing, so we can fix this much needed housing shortage that we've been dealing with for many decades now, and especially acutely in the last few years. So the nice thing about a land value tax, right, as I've shown, is that it encourages dense, efficient development within cities. And I've talked a lot so far about what it does within cities. But the really nice thing, and that is an eco-tax in many senses, right? Because it encourages, if we're going to build housing anywhere, right, we're going to build it within these urban infills areas, or even in suburban areas, it just makes the suburban development denser and therefore more energy efficient, more cost, or more resource efficient and whatnot, right, on a per capita basis. But the really nice thing too is that it makes suburban sprawl expensive, because right now suburban sprawl is not particularly expensive. Most of those costs are heavily externalized. Under a land value tax, the cost of spreading out into this marginal land, right? Like I mentioned earlier, right here, this 10 util plot of land, that finally becomes expensive relative to developing within this more productive land instead. So what happens is we no longer have nearly as much suburban sprawl. So we aren't going to be bleeding into and tearing down these forests, natural habitats, or you know, destroying the environment around us. And instead, best case scenario, some of that development will push more inwards, or at the very least, the expansion of our city borders and our city limits stops, because we have plenty of land within the current city limits of most cities in the United States to fill into. We have a lot of unused, a lot of vacant land. We really don't need to be expanding further out to supply housing to the current or even future population for that matter. And that's what a land value tax essentially does, right? But I think it's particularly useful to think about what a land value tax does in the context of California, right? Oh, I see a hand that's raised up.
Sorry, am I allowed to ask questions right now?
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Okay, it's more of a point of clarification, a question. So like, and I guess maybe you might get to this in the context of California, but if you're taxing the land in the same way or for this at the same rate as like unimproved land as any land with improvements, including buildings, does that serve to reduce the overall tax revenue of a city? Or like what are the implications of this that you've seen in places? Like I understand why it incentivizes, say, it could incentivize development in the sense that a landowner wouldn't be paying additional tax, but would be obtaining additional income, I guess, or revenue.
Mm-hmm.
But does it reduce, what does it do for overall tax to the state?
Yeah, so that's actually a very timely question, because that's right on the next slide. So most of the within a property, and this kind of ranges from parcel to parcel, but generally speaking, a lot of the value is actually in land, frankly, right? So whenever a property assessor, whenever a property tax assessor looks at especially a downtown building, right? Most of the value that they see in that is really from the underlying land, right? And the potential for productivity that land has. So in the case of California, right, if we were to just tax land values, you would see a substantial tax revenue that has never been realized before in California's history. So from 2000, there's a paper from the Bureau of Economic Analysis back in 2009. So it's a bit outdated, and this was based on 2008 data, and this is the best that I can find, because most property tax assessors, they value the whole property as one whole thing, right? Very rarely, because of how the property tax system is today throughout the United States and most other countries, quite frankly. They value it all equally together. It's all kind of lumped into the same asset, which is, again, a very gross misunderstanding of how land and buildings are, because they're very much different, right? It's kind of hard to find good data on this, but luckily the Bureau of Economic Analysis has done wonderful data analysis on this. And what they found is that in California in 2008, there was about $4 trillion of land. And their estimation there was more based on the actual price of it. And and this brings me to the next slide, whenever we talk about taxing the value of land, because value and price are very different, right? So generally speaking, as a rule, the land price or the land value tends to represent about 10 to 15% of the land price. And this is something that you would be getting every year, right? That land value is equivalent to the land rents, right? So in California, if based on 2008 data, if we were to institute a 100% land value tax, the state of California could bring in nearly $400 billion in revenue. And this is almost double the 2021 budget proposed by Governor Newsom. Also, for more context, the California high-speed rail, I think so far has cost about $105 billion. So under just a land value tax, the state of California could build 4 California high-speed rails every single year, year after year, if it really wanted to. And that is the very, I think, interesting and phenomenal aspect of a land value tax, is its potential to bring in so much government revenue to pay for all these public services that we direly need, and at the same time has the ability to eliminate all these other regressive forms of taxation, right? Things like sales tax, which, as I mentioned before, is incredibly regressive. Income taxes, also very regressive, even though, we very much try to make it like a progressive regressive taxation by stratifying this out into different tax brackets, right? So that higher earners get taxed a little bit more. At the end of the day, though, you are punishing people supplying their labor, which is something that is needed in society and in the economy, right? So, and you can also at the same time potentially eliminate traditional property taxes, elimination the taxing on buildings, right? Which is again something that is elastic in its supply. So rather than decreasing the supply of consumption, decreasing the supply of income, or decreasing the supply of housing and buildings, and at the same time increasing the price of these things, right? What we can do is eliminate the deadweight loss that comes from those taxes, and instead rely heavily upon a land value tax. And there's some kind of discussion about whether or not a land value tax is enough to pay for all government expenditures, right? It's kind of hard to tell because there are things in California, especially in many other states, that depress land values because of certain property tax laws, right? That make it very difficult to accurately assess what is land value. So most of the time we've been underestimating actually how much land value there really is. But even if we use the most conservative estimates, which is what this $390 billion number comes from, is a very conservative estimate of land values in the state of California, it's still nearly double what the state has been spending from taxing people's hard-earned labor and consumption and property and all that, right? So hopefully I think that maybe answers your question about like what the revenues would look like in a situation where we shift away from taxing buildings and instead start taxing land instead. And the other fun part, as I mentioned before, right, is that downtown parking land, vacant land, or just more generally like inefficiently used land, especially when it's closer to the urban core, becomes very expensive relative to the behavior of actually developing on that land. And it takes away those pressures from developing on marginal land towards the outskirts that's far less productive. And there's actually a bill that was introduced in the current legislative session in California. I forget the representative's name, that's going to study the effects of a land value tax in California. And it's essentially going to say the same thing, which is all these wonderful things. We get better infill, more efficient developments, higher tax revenues, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, land value tax is kind of illegal in the state of California for certain reasons, which I'll get to in the next slide. But yes, there's a question.
Oops, there we go. So I know we're talking a lot about like buildings. We're focusing on buildings a lot. Like, I guess this is more of just out of curiosity, because you had mentioned like, farmers in the first example. Do you see like, maybe more urban farms like being prioritized as open land in the cities more than just like developing more buildings? I think like I haven't done like any research on like if we have enough housing to actually house people, or in the process of already having enough housing. But, you know, seeing maybe other types of development, like, you know, to provide like local food or local, you know, native gardens or areas of greenery. What are your thoughts on that?
So there's it's kind of, okay, so there's like some mixed results that come from this, right? So like what I can say about more broadly greenery, right? So what a land value tax won't do is it's not going to turn every city into the sort of things that you see at the top of the urban gore subreddit, right? Where it's just all buildings everywhere, right? Because that's not very aesthetically pleasing, quite frankly. And again, one of the main things that comes from land value, right, is the community. And there's plenty of empiric analysis, and also just kind of from intuition, we know that, for example, in New York City, right, the skyscrapers and housing that are right along Central Park are worth a lot more than the housing that's a bit a ways away, right? Even though, generally speaking, like, just because you're 6 blocks away from Central Park, does that really make you any less productive? No, not really. But the reason why those plots of land around Central Park are so appealing is because parks are beautiful, trees are beautiful. People love to see trees and greenery and whatnot in downtown, right? So having a nice mix of that in downtown, or just throughout the city in general, right, actually does raise land values. So this is something that would be encouraged, if anything, by a land value tax, is the conservation of parcels of land throughout the city for conservation, right? And also just having within the streets themselves, right? More greenery, more trees lining the streets. Those also tend to be of higher land value as well. They're more desirable. To what, you know, extent specifically, how far that's going to go, there's obviously geometric limits to how many trees we can stuff within a street, right? And I'm sure a land value tax will probably drive it up to that point. But as for things like community gardens or community farms, right? Again, if the community values something like that, right, then that gets incorporated into the land value of the surrounding lands as well, right? And, you know, for people who are very rightfully concerned about the market implications of this, right? Because, you know, if we're talking about like a complete free market where we're just letting that decide which parcels of land have farms, which ones have nature conservations, whatnot, right? You can see some outcomes that may be less ecologically desirable or ecologically beneficial for the city. And this is where the government can also step in as well and simply zone certain areas and say that, okay, well, no, this will be, you know, for conservation, right? This will be for a park, or this will be, you know, kept for an urban farm and whatnot, right? And that is something that does happen already, right? Even in cities and jurisdictions that have land value taxes. Singapore, I think, is actually kind of a great example of this. Singapore is probably the best case study for land value tax in the world. And Singapore is kind of known as this urban garden because of the, I don't know specific, I know Oslo is the greenest city in the world, but I know Singapore is like in the top 10 when you measure by tree canopy, right? So, and it also benefits that it's equatorial located city, right? But, you know, it's a city state, an island, and it has to very efficiently use its land. And even with those pressures, lots of forestry, lots of green. So long story short, you know, people value urban gardens, they value greenery, and that gets internalized and incorporated into the land value itself, right? Whereas right now, not so much, you know. Now we have to rely on the government intervening to make sure that those things actually happen. But with the land value tax, you get both. You get both the market incentive for greenery within cities, and you also have the government also being incentivized to mandate that existing in the first place. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. This is kind of where we run into the sad part of the presentation in the case of California, which is that Prop 13 sucks, and I wish that they had never done it. You know, so I'm in Seattle, and we have a very similar thing in the state of Washington, which is the uniformity clause. The uniformity clause mandates that all property, all real property, to be treated equally when it comes to being taxed, right? So buildings, improvements, and land all have to be taxed at the exact same rate, no matter what. We also have a property tax cap at 1% as well, so it's very similar to Prop 13. And so the problem, of course, being in California and also in Oregon as well, I think, and Washington, is that there is a constitutional barrier to this eco tax and this very efficient land tax, right? And for those of you who don't know the history of Prop 13, this is something that was implemented, backed, and heavily encouraged by landed interests, people who just quite frankly did not like the idea of having to pay their fair share in taxes for owning a good that, again, they did not create, right? Was made by nobody. And that they themselves, by ownership of this land, did not do anything to increase its productiveness or usefulness of it. It's the community that did all this, right? So as a result of Prop 13, the state of California has been forced into using more regressive forms of taxation, right? Sales tax, income tax, all these other different kinds. And unfortunately, as is the case in Washington and other states where there's a constitutional barrier to good things, it's going to essentially require repealing Prop 13 in order to implement a land value tax. So if you ever want to, not have to pay income taxes, if you don't want your labor to be punished, if you no longer want to see through taxation, if you no longer want to have to pay an extra surcharge just because you're trying to buy food for yourself, your family, your loved ones, right? And if instead you would prefer to rely on taxing landlords, essentially, this will have to go away, right? And it's unfortunate that 20th century voters did this, but here we are, right? And I don't want to sound necessarily, I don't want to, rain on the whole parade here, because I don't think that this is necessarily going to be always and forever, right? Where Prop 13 is just never going to go away. I do believe that hopefully, and I think the mood is changing in particular among the California youth, that this is a very poorly thought out decision that is wreaking havoc on the state, on housing affordability and whatnot. So I do think that there is hope in the future that it will be repealed, and when it does, that would be a fantastic time to capitalize on it and implement something like a land value tax, which is gaining a lot more traction, a lot more popularity. Like I mentioned earlier, Common Ground California chapter is our most prominent chapter within the country. Lots of environmental organizations are also catching on to land value tax and pushing for it. Today, the Sierra Club tweeted about land value tax, which was wonderful to see, and gives significant support for it, right? So kind of to sum up, and I would like to tie this back around to more general eco taxes, right? The thing that I think is really special about land value taxes, like I said before, it's a tax on something that has a fixed supply, right? And it's a tax on land, a tax on economic land, right? So, like I said earlier, land, right, in the economic terms is something that created by nature, fixed in supply, right, and generates economic rent. So in economics, we talk about like different ways that we can use to change or nudge behavior in the right direction, right? So a big debate that's kind of happening about how do we regulate or incentivize or discourage or change behavior, pollutive behavior. And there's been kind of like regulations, permits, and then of course pollution tax, right? Regulations, first and foremost, they have a purpose. They are very effective when used correctly. Oftentimes, they kind of suck, right? If anybody is a big fan of the Not Just Bikes video channel, he put out a video today about how SUVs have exploded in popularity in the last decade because of Obama era regulations about fuel efficiency. And because of corporate lobbying, mostly, they were able to exempt light trucks and classify SUVs as light trucks. So they were exempt from these fuel efficiency and safety standards. And so as a result, SUVs have now been the car of choice for most Americans today. And they're leading to a significant uptick in pedestrian deaths. They take up a lot of land, they pollute. If they were a nation, they would be the 6th most polluting nation in the world, just all SUVs total, right? And then of course, so regulations, right? They're kind of difficult to properly design and implement, and sometimes they could go wrong. Permits are kind of like a slightly better version of this, right? They sometimes raise revenue for governments, where regulations usually don't. Regulations only kind of raise revenue in the form of fines, if ever charged. And permits, right? They also kind of have their downsides because they allow for the financialization of pollution, essentially, right? You can create financial instruments and derivatives that allow for corporations to get around their bad, destructive, pollutive behavior. Pollution tax, on the other hand, goes right directly at the source, right? It treats the atmosphere as land, it treats it as a fixed resource, a natural resource that in which we should be charging polluters for their direct impacts onto the atmosphere, onto this fixed resource that we all need for survival, right? And there's also ways of doing that through like remote sensing and whatnot, so that we can actually find out where these pollutions are coming from. So I think hopefully the takeaway from this is that a land value tax acts as a very, very strong, but also kind of in the background type of eco tax, right? Encourages productivity, it encourages dense development in cities that are more energy efficient, more resource efficient, right? And they also are, it's also a very nice supplement to other eco taxes as well, right? When paired together, it can do a lot. And they also raise a lot of revenue that is going to be very necessary for governments to build this green, clean, sustainable public infrastructure that we're going to need in the face of climate change, right? Public transportation, bike lanes, maybe salination, utility infrastructure, especially in the case of California, as the Colorado River starts to dry up more and more every year, right? So a lot of this stuff is going to cost money. And if we're going to get it anywhere, I and many people who believe the landlords should have to pay their taxes for once think that it should come from them. So that's land value tax. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate taking the time to listen to me rant about property taxes on a Monday night. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer anything. It's a very meaty topic for sure. But yeah.
Yeah, I see Paula has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess I was just thinking, like, what do you think are the implications for people who want to buy a home, who think that that's like a thing that they want to do?
Oh yeah, so this is fantastic for that, actually, because just as an implication of a land value tax increasing the use of this vacant, unused land, especially in the case of like parking lots, for example, right? What happens is, as a result, is that land gets infilled with a greater supply of housing stock, right? And so as a result of that, as the housing stock dramatically increases from a land value tax, you see the general price of housing go down, right? And we also, this is of course assuming that we decide to do lots of reform on zoning and land use regulations. This would allow for a greater variety and diversity of housing options, right? Instead of just 85% of the land being zoned off for single family detached homes with huge setbacks, pollutive yards and all that, you can have condominiums, you can have housing in sixplexes or a duplex or whatever in between, middle missing, all that good jazz, right? So you get a more efficient housing stock, a greater supply of the housing stock as well, and you get more housing in these more productive areas. So instead of wealthy, in the case of like, so Seattle, we have a really big problem of a lot of tech workers, right? Which is great. I love tech workers. But the problem is we don't have a lot of housing, and we don't have a lot of housing around where they work. So they're forced into renting out housing towards, further and further out, which is actually a big cause of gentrification, right? It pushes lower income people out of housing that they otherwise should be able to afford, right? So by building up this infill, those wealthier people can actually go and instead rent out of places closer to their wealthier jobs where they're working, and that leaves that housing to lower income people so they can actually afford to live in their city again. So that's also really nice. It's beneficial to anybody who's looking to get a house or to rent, right? You know, all kinds of housing in general. But yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, Kurt.
I guess my only question is how, I know this is probably a big topic and we're kind of running out of time, but just broad strokes, how would they even assess the value of the land? Like whose responsibility would that be and how would that actually, like it just broadly, how would that even occur?
Yeah, so I realize I've been rambling a lot, so I'll try to keep this one a bit brief, even though it's a very important aspect of a land value tax system. So right now we already have property tax assessors on the payroll of the government, right, that are very skilled at doing this, and they do it through a variety of different ways, right? So if you have like a parking lot, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but parking lots are actually kind of useful in this case, because it's essentially nothing. There's no improvements, right? It's just flat land. So the property or the parking lot as vacant land, you can assess the value of that, right, through traditional property tax assessment methods. And then if you have a adjacent parcel of land that has a building on it, right, and in this case, if we're ignoring the value of that building, what you can say is, okay, what's the value of this parking lot per square foot or whatever, per square acre, and then you can apply that to surrounding parcels of land, right? So this is especially useful if we already have lots of empty land in downtowns, which we do. And you can create, if for anyone who's familiar with GIS data analysis, you can create gradients and some regression analyses going in there to kind of extrapolate the value of that. Another more kind of theoretical / crude method is knowing that the price of something represents essentially the value, rents, right, minus the costs of owning and operating that, which in this case, the ownership of land is essentially zero, right? So whenever you say you're willing to pay $10 million for a price of land, you're essentially saying, okay, I'm willing to pay $10 million and I expect to generate at least $10 million of rent out of this land for however long I intend to own it, right? So that also kind of gives an idea of what the annual rent value of that land is. That's more of a market solution to things. That's part of they're called victory auctions, which are used. It's bidding and using the second highest bid to determine what is the value of that. So that way people kind of like honestly bid what they think the value of the land is, right? So if you're uncomfortable with the idea of the government bidding or with the government defining the value of land, and if you're more inclined to letting the people who are going to own and use the land, if you let them honestly tell what they think the land is worth to them, right? That's also a solution. You can use a mix of those. But yeah, there's lots of different ways, and they're generally, they got their ups and downs. Some are more efficient than others. But generally speaking, we're pretty good at assessing the value of land in that way.
One more.
Yeah, Kenny.
So would you say that it's kind of similar to the, sorry, I just moved my table. Would you say that it's kind of similar to the, what was it called? Agricultural Act, or like, because like you have to, it's based on like, okay, yes, like this land has value if you're going to be using it efficiently, and like you're actually going to be producing something from this land, right? So like the value is more based on the efficiency of the land that you're going to be using. But in this case, it's like you're really utilizing the efficiency of this land like to the maximum that you possibly can, instead of like expanding. Just to clarify.
Yeah, I'm not acutely familiar with the agricultural act that you're referring to, but if you're talking about in the case of what the implications are for a land value tax for farmland,
yes, that.
So, So the interestingly enough, the land value tax is actually it's a very old concept. It first came from 17th century French farmers that were really annoyed about having to pay property taxes on their equipment, on their farms and whatnot, and they felt that a tax instead on the land would be much fairer, right? Because and also they were also being taxed on the produce of an ad valorem tax for every like grain or bushel, whatever
What
is.
the?
I know it's crazy, right? So they were known as the physiocrats, if you're ever interested in reading that Wikipedia article. And because for them, a land value tax, right, it's more fair. It rewards farmers that more efficiently use their land and don't expand further and further again into this more marginal land, right? And I think also another implication too, in regards to farming is that if you think about like pastures, right, and sort of the meat industry, very land inefficient, right? Generally speaking, incredibly land inefficient. Corn, soybean, wheat, all these, the more vegetarian / vegan diet, quite frankly, is more land efficient. So that if you're somebody who enjoys steak dinners, you might not be a big fan of land value tax, I'm going to be honest. But it's good for the environment in that case, right? So it's better, yeah, long story short, it's better for farmers who more efficiently use their land. It's better for farmers who take better ecological care of their land and don't do a lot of the more destructive land uses, like for example, that we saw in the 1930s, or I guess 1920s before the Dust Bowl, right? That would be incredibly land inefficient and bad for land values, right? And it also encourages like modern day things, right? We're seeing a huge growth in farmers putting solar panels above their farmland, which actually increases crop yields because I'm not a biologist, but from what I understand, the shade provides, it helps with not like bleaching the plants and killing them off from too much sunlight. So that shade from the solar panels actually kind of helps them. And it generates revenue for the farmers themselves by taking that electricity and selling it off to the grid, clean electricity too, right? Which is nice. So I guess that is kind of the more general implication of a land value tax in regards to farming,
Okay.
right?
And it also is like it's like the land tax is kind of like an accountability measure too, in a way. So like it
In a way,
holds people accountable for the responsibilities they're taking on for using this land, right?
right,
So like
yeah.
the more land they take on, the more taxes they have to take on, so that they have to be smarter with the responsibilities that they're taking on with this certain like acres of land.
Yeah, and
So
it makes them only take on the land if they actually intend to develop it as well, right? And I think another really nice thing about it too is that so it's not going to be 100% clear. It's not going to completely eliminate all misuse of land, but what it will do is two things. It will make misuse of land expensive, and it'll provide revenues to the government to clean up when they do misuse that land. Because right now, there really is no revenue coming from land misuse, right? Or just land use really in general, right? We kind of have to tax people's sales. We have to tax their income to clean up for these ecological disasters, right? Or in the occasional case, maybe they pay like a $3 million fine for causing $4 billion in damages, right? But under a land value tax, much different. It becomes a lot more expensive to pollute and to destroy the land and the environment.
that makes sense. So I had read this in an article. I'm actually taking a climate science class right now, and there was a quote in one of the articles that we were reading is that we have to find a way to make restorative mindsets profitable. And sounds like this could be like a new doorway to making that a reality consecutively,
Sure, yeah.
because you're finding a way to make being environmentally conscious profitable and more efficient. So you have to like try to make being less destructive more appetizing than being destructive. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it does. It makes being good with your environment more profitable, and it makes treating it like trash expensive. And again, at the same time, gives tax revenue to the government to come in and clean up when that does happen. Or also at the same time, a citizen's dividend, right? Just because, I mean, you know, it is the community that made that land value, right? It's us. We bring value to land. And this is a thing that a lot of proponents of land value tax advocate for in general, which is that if you're going to pass a land value tax, it should come with a citizen's dividend from the outset. Also for political reasons, just so it doesn't go away, right? If you think about like Social Security, that's not going away. It's political suicide to get rid of Social Security because that's like a guaranteed stipend. And a citizen's dividend would essentially function in the same way, right? If you tried to like, if we said from the outset, okay, 10% of all land values taxed are going to just go right back to the people in a flat, however much per person, right? Trying to take that away is going to be kind of politically difficult. So, but you know, as an aside, long story short, like you said, it makes, you know, being ecologically mindful, profitable, and expensive to do the opposite, which I think is wonderful.
And that dividend that you're just talking about also helps keep some of the money circulating within the immediate economy of that community.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Because like I know like a huge issue when it comes to like communities being able to sustain themselves is that there's so many companies that profit off a community and take the money out of the community, you know, including like what property owners do with like apartments and stuff like that. All that money doesn't stay within that community. Whoever gets the most of it at the top, they take it.
Right, 100%.
So.
And even, you know, even if a citizen's dividend isn't 100% of the land value, right? I mean, governments can be sometimes efficient about spending that money, sometimes a little bit less efficient about spending that money, right? At the very least, that citizen's dividend is kind of like a pure efficient, okay, this is what you brought to the land values, you're getting it right back. We still have to fund the government, but you know, if there's a surplus from that, then people get rewarded for being productive and bringing you know, value to an area, which is I think is very nice.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. And then in just the last minute or so, I wanted to just say Kaylee had a question. Who then has the most to lose with this? Is it landowners holding unimproved or underimproved land? Briefly, we're just about to close out here.
Yeah, no, it's mostly them. It's landlords. It's landlords who really like to exploit their tenants, and land speculators. Those are the people who most oppose a land value tax because they have the most to lose. Yeah.
Welcome.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. If we can all either unmute or give an emoji and say thank you, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was very informative, very knowledgeable, very interesting. We really appreciate your time and sharing with us.
Thank
No,
you for
thank you so
taking the
much for
time
having
to
me.
clarify it too.
Yeah, no, of course. I love talking about property taxes. I never would have thought that this is something that gets me excited, but its implications are huge for you know, public services and the environment. It's wonderful.